At 1:30 hours on January 30th, 1944, Sergeant Major Robert E. Holt checked his watch and whispered into the darkness. Behind him, stretched out in single file along a drainage ditch beside the Mussolini Canal, walked 767 Rangers, 1st and 3rd Battalions, the best America had. They moved in total silence through the freezing Italian night. No lights, no talking, just the sound of boots in mud and the quiet clink of equipment against webbing. Their objective was a small Italian town called Cisterna, 3 miles ahead. Intelligence said the path was clear. Scattered German outposts, light resistance, a quick night infiltration, seize the town before dawn, hold it until the 3rd Infantry Division linked up. Simple. Intelligence was dead wrong. What waited for them at Cisterna was not a lightly defended outpost. It was 2 full German divisions. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division with 17 concealed Panzer IV tanks. The 715th Infantry Division dug in on 3 sides. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had personally ordered every available unit into position around that town. Let that sink in for a moment. 2 full divisions, tanks, artillery, thousands of German soldiers, all positioned to stop fewer than 800 Americans. Why? Why would the German High Command dedicate that level of firepower against a single battalion-sized force? You do not move 2 divisions to stop 800 men, unless those 800 men terrify you. By late afternoon that day, the Rangers had fought for over 8 hours, surrounded, out of ammunition, German tanks firing point blank into their positions. Sergeant Major E. Holt made one final radio call to Colonel William Darby back at the command post. He told Darby the 1st Battalion commander was wounded. The 3rd Battalion executive officer was dead. Tanks were closing in. Then E. Holt said 5 words that still echo through Ranger history. "So long, Colonel. Maybe when it's all over I'll see you again." He destroyed the radio. Kept fighting. Of those 767 Rangers, only 6 made it back to Allied lines. Darby, the man who built the Rangers from nothing, who loved them more than his own career, wept openly when the reports came in. Hardened combat officers who had never seen him show emotion watched the founder of the Rangers break down. Cisterna was the worst day in Ranger history, but here is what most people miss about that disaster. Even surrounded, outnumbered 10 to 1, out of ammunition, facing tanks at point-blank range, Rangers fought with bayonets and rifle butts. They counterattacked against impossible odds. They refused to surrender until they were physically unable to lift a weapon. German after-action reports from Cisterna noted something remarkable. They wrote that American Rangers displayed combat motivation and determination that exceeded standard Wehrmacht infantry. That assessment, from an enemy that respected combat effectiveness above all else, tells you everything. But to understand why the Germans feared Rangers more than any other Allied unit, to understand why Cisterna happened the way it did, to understand what made these men different, we need to go back 2 years, to a castle in the Scottish Highlands, to a 31-year-old artillery officer from Arkansas who had never led a commando raid in his life, and to a decision by the U.S. Army that would change the way Americans fight wars forever. This is the forensic breakdown of the most feared American fighting force of World War II. Part 1. The Birth of a Weapon. The year is 1942. America has been at war for 6 months, and it is losing. Japanese forces have swept through the Pacific. In Europe, Hitler controls everything from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, and the United States Army has a problem that nobody wants to talk about publicly. American soldiers have never fought Germans. Not once. Not a single engagement. British and Commonwealth troops have been fighting the Wehrmacht since 1939. They have 3 years of hard lessons paid for in blood. The Soviets have been locked in the largest ground war in human history for a year. Americans? They have been training, reading manuals, running drills on fields in Georgia and Tennessee. But they have never heard a German MG-42 rip through their position at 1,200 rounds per minute. They have never tried to advance against pre-registered artillery. They do not know what real combat feels like. And the top brass knows it. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, the man running America's war machine, understood this gap better than anyone. He visited the British Commando training depot and saw something that changed his thinking. Small units of highly trained men, volunteers who had been pushed beyond what normal infantry could endure, were conducting raids along the occupied coast of Europe. These commandos could accomplish objectives that entire battalions could not achieve through conventional assault. They moved at night. They infiltrated enemy lines. They killed sentries with knives. They struck from directions the enemy never expected, and then they disappeared. Marshall made a decision. America needed its own version of this, not a copy of the British commandos. Something American, something that could serve as a cutting edge for the untested American army. On June 1st, 1942, he ordered the creation of a new unit. It would be called the Rangers, named after the frontier raiders led by Major Robert Rogers during the French and Indian War nearly 2 centuries earlier. The question was, who would build it? The answer came from an unlikely place. Captain William Orlando Darby, 31 years old, born in Fort Smith, Arkansas, West Point class of 1933, an artillery officer, not infantry, not special operations, artillery. He had never conducted a commando raid, never led men in combat. His experience was in fire direction and battery management. On paper, he was the wrong man for the job, but Darby had something that experience could not teach, and training could not replicate. He had presence. When Darby walked into a room, men paid attention. When he spoke, they listened, not because of rank, because of something in his voice, in his eyes, that made men want to follow him into places they would never go alone. Within weeks of his selection, he was promoted to major. Remember that. An artillery captain, promoted within weeks, to build a unit that would become the most feared American force in the European theater. Why am I telling you this detail? Because Darby's leadership is the single thread that connects everything that follows. Without him, there are no Rangers. Period. 2,000 men volunteered. Think about that number. 2,000 Americans stepped forward for a job described only as hazardous duty. No details, no promises, no guarantee they would survive training, let alone combat. Just hazardous duty, and men lined up. Darby selected 600. The screening was ruthless. Physical fitness tests that eliminated half the candidates on the spot. Interviews that probed motivation, temperament, mental toughness. Background checks that filtered out anyone with disciplinary issues. Darby wanted the best. He also wanted something specific. He wanted men who could think for themselves. Rangers would not fight in massive formations with officers directing every movement. They would operate in small groups, at night, behind enemy lines, where individual initiative meant the difference between success and death. On June 19, 1942, Company A, 1st Ranger Battalion, was officially activated at Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland. 600 men with uniforms, rifles, and basic infantry training. They had the desire. They had the guts. What they did not have was any idea how to be Rangers. That education would come at a place called Achnacarry Castle. In late June, Darby marched his 600 volunteers to a train at Belfast, then out to Fort William in the Scottish Highlands. From the train station, the Cameron Highlanders' bagpipes sounded the call, and a burly British officer named Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan greeted them with a warm smile and led them on a 14-mile forced march, with full packs to the training center. Men dropped out on the march. Some collapsed. Some quit. By the time the column reached the ancient turrets of Achnacarry, the first cut had already been made. Achnacarry Castle sat in a remote glen between Loch Arkaig and Loch Lochy, once a refuge for Bonnie Prince Charlie, now the finest infantry training center on the planet, run by Colonel Vaughan, nicknamed the Rommel of the North. Vaughan's instructors were commando veterans who had fought in Norway and France. They had killed Germans. They knew what worked and what got men killed. Imagine yourself there, sleeping in a bell tent, bathing in an ice-cold stream, eating bully beef and plum pudding. When the Americans complained, Vaughan told Darby with an impish grin, "It's all part of the training, William." The training was brutal. Forced marches through Scottish mountains carrying 80-pound packs, cliff climbing, hand-to-hand combat, night navigation by compass, learning to kill sentries quietly with knives. amphibious landings in rough seas, street fighting, demolitions, all conducted under live ammunition, actual bullets over the heads of crawling rangers, actual explosives detonating near moving formations. One ranger was killed during training, several were wounded, but the 500 who completed the course at Achnacarry were transformed. They were not the same men who had marched up from Fort William weeks earlier. They were harder, faster, more confident, and they carried something invisible but unmistakable, a belief that they could go places and do things that regular infantry could not. Derby made one rule that set the tone for everything. Officers trained first. Every new obstacle, every exercise, every miserable freezing drill, the ranking officer present was the first to attempt it. Derby included himself. He told his officers, "If I ask my men to climb a cliff in the dark, I climb it first. If I ask them to wade through a freezing stream, I'm already wet when they get there." That rule sounds simple. It is not. It is the reason men followed Derby into places where following meant dying, and it is the reason Rangers became what they became. But training, no matter how brutal, means nothing until it meets reality. The Rangers were about to get their first taste of combat, and it would come at one of the worst Allied disasters of the entire war. A beach in France where thousands of men would die in a single morning, and where the very first American soldier would fall in ground combat in the European theater. He was a Ranger, and he was 22 years old. Part 2. Blood and Reputation. August 19th, 1942. Operation Jubilee, the raid on Dieppe, France. Before the full battalion had even completed training at Achnacarry, 50 Rangers were attached to British and Canadian forces for what was supposed to be a large-scale test of German coastal defenses. 6,000 Allied troops would hit the beaches at Dieppe, gather intelligence, prove that amphibious raids could work, and withdraw. It was a catastrophe. German forces were ready. Canadian infantry were slaughtered on the beaches. Of 6,000 men who landed, more than 3,000 were killed or captured. But in the middle of that disaster, something remarkable happened. 4 Rangers were assigned to No. 4 Commando for an assault on the Hesse battery at Varengeville, 6 German 150mm guns in fortified positions that were raking the invasion beaches. While the main assault collapsed into carnage, the commandos and these 4 Rangers infiltrated through woods, approached from an unexpected direction, and destroyed the battery in close-quarters combat. It was the only Allied success at Dieppe. Meanwhile, 2nd Lieutenant Edward Feeb Loustalot was with No. 3 Commando at Berneval. He was 22 years old, from Maryville, Louisiana. When their landing craft were spotted by German patrol boats, only 3 boats made it to shore under heavy fire. The British captain leading the assault was killed almost immediately. Loustalot did not hesitate. He took command. He led his Rangers and the surviving commandos up steep cliffs under machine gun and mortar fire. He was wounded once, kept climbing, wounded twice, kept fighting. On his 3rd wound, while trying to suppress a German gun position, he was killed. Edward Loustalot became the first American soldier to die in ground combat in the European theater of World War II. Let that settle for a moment. The first American to fall fighting Germans in Europe was not from an infantry division, not from an armored unit. He was a Ranger, and the way he died, leading from the front, absorbing wounds and continuing to advance, set a pattern that would repeat itself in every Ranger engagement for the next 3 years. German defenders at Dieppe noted something in their after-action reports. American Rangers attached to commando units displayed exceptional aggression and disregard for casualties. Remember that phrase. You will hear echoes of it from German reports in Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Hurtgen Forest. Every single time. Now Dieppe was a disaster, but Derby squeezed every drop of knowledge from it. When the surviving Rangers returned, he debriefed them relentlessly. What worked? What failed? What did the Germans do? How did they react? The lesson was clear. The Rangers needed more training, more planning, more reconnaissance, more intelligence. Derby rebuilt the training program from the ground up, and 3 months later, the Rangers got their chance. November 8th, 1942. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. The Rangers' mission was surgical. capture 2 coastal batteries at Arzu, Algeria, before they could fire on the invasion fleet. 2 batteries, the Batterie du Nord and Batterie Supérieure, manned by French colonial troops loyal to Vichy France. The Rangers would land at night, move inland, and assault both batteries simultaneously from behind before dawn. At 0 hours on November 8th, 2 companies landed east of Arzu in complete darkness. They moved inland by compass. No lights, no noise. At 0300, both companies attacked simultaneously. French defenders were caught completely by surprise. Rangers came over the walls with grenades and rifle fire. Close quarters combat in gun emplacements. 20 minutes. Both batteries secured. The invasion fleet landed unopposed. 0 Ranger casualties. General Eisenhower was so impressed that he tried to promote Darby to brigadier general on the spot. Darby declined. He knew that promotion meant a transfer to a new command, and William Darby would not leave his Rangers. Not for a star. Not for anything. Remember that detail. It will matter at the end of this story. 3 months passed. Then came the operation that gave the Rangers a name, that struck fear into Axis soldiers. February 11th, 1943. Sened Station, Tunisia. The first American behind-the-lines raid of the war. Darby's plan was simple and brutal. 3 companies would march 12 miles through enemy territory at night, approach an Italian outpost from the rear, assault at dawn, grab prisoners for intelligence, destroy the position, and vanish before German reinforcements arrived. But before they moved out, Captain Roy Murray gathered his men and gave them an order that would define Ranger culture forever. "They've got to know that they've been worked over by Rangers," Murray said. "Every man is to use his bayonet as much as he can. Those are our orders." In the darkness before dawn, faces blackened, dog tags taped silent, the Rangers crept to within 50 yards of the Italian positions. The attack erupted like a thunderclap. Rangers swept through the camp with grenades, rifles, and bayonets. 75 Italian soldiers from the elite 10th Bersaglieri Regiment were killed in 20 minutes. 11 prisoners taken, including an officer who provided critical intelligence. 1 Ranger wounded. Total Ranger casualties. The ferocity of that attack earned the Rangers a nickname from the Italians. They called them La Morte Nera, the Black Death. A month later, at El Ghoutar in Tunisia, the Rangers cemented their reputation in a way that forced German intelligence to reassess everything they thought they knew about American troops. American forces under General Patton were stopped cold by fortified defenses in the mountains east of El Ghoutar. The key was Jebel El Ankh, a fortified ridge that dominated every approach. 2 American infantry battalions had been thrown against it. Both were shot to pieces. Machine guns in concrete bunkers covered every avenue. The position was considered impregnable. Patton gave the mission to Darby, and Darby proposed something that sounded insane: a 12-mile night march through unmapped mountain terrain around the entire German flank to attack the ridge from behind at dawn. On the night of March 20th, 1943, Darby led 500 Rangers into the mountains. They navigated by compass through gorges with no trails. They climbed rocky slopes carrying full combat loads. Noise discipline was so complete that German sentries less than 100 meters away heard nothing. At dawn, 6 Ranger companies hit Jebel El Ankh from the rear. German defenders were facing the opposite direction, positioned for frontal assaults from the valley. Rangers came over the crest with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Close combat in trenches. Hand-to-hand fighting in bunkers. Within 2 hours, the ridge was taken. 200 German and Italian prisoners. Patton's armor poured through the gap. El Ghoutar became the first major American victory against German forces in World War II. German intelligence reports from Tunisia told the story. They described the 1st Ranger Battalion as a significant threat. Small unit, lightly armed, but exceptionally well-trained and led. Capable of night infiltration operations that bypassed defensive positions. Willing to close with German forces in hand-to-hand combat. Did not retreat under fire. German commanders began adjusting their defensive plans specifically because of Rangers. A single battalion was forcing changes in how the entire German defense was organized. Think about that math. 500 men were reshaping how a continental army defended itself. The success in North Africa triggered rapid expansion. Darby was ordered to form 2 additional battalions. Had 3 battalions ready. Everything the 3rd and 4th Ranger battalions were activated in North Africa in May 1943. Darby split his original battalion into thirds to provide experienced cadre. In 3 weeks, he had 3 battalions ready. Everything the Rangers had built, every lesson from Aknakari, Dieppe, Arzew, Sened Station, and El Gueta, was about to be tested in the furnace of Sicily and Italy, where they would reach the peak of their powers, and where the very success that made them famous would lead them straight into the worst trap of the war. But that is a story for the next part, and it begins with 17 German tanks rolling toward a beach, and 1 American colonel who grabbed a 37mm gun and fired it himself. Part 3, From Triumph to Catastrophe, July 10th, 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. In the pre-dawn darkness, the 1st and 4th Ranger battalions landed at Gela, ahead of the 1st Infantry Division. Their mission was to seize the port and neutralize coastal defenses before the main landing force came ashore. Rangers assaulted directly off the landing craft into Italian pillbox fire, grenades, rifle fire, close combat. Within 4 hours, Gela was in Ranger hands. Then the Hermann Göring Panzer Division counterattacked. 46 medium tanks, Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs rolling toward the beach to drive the invasion back into the sea. The Rangers had no heavy anti-tank weapons, bazookas and grenades against German armor. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore helped, but German tanks kept pressing forward. They reached to within 300 meters of the beach, and then Darby did something that became legend. He personally manned a captured 37mm gun and opened fire on the approaching tanks. A colonel, standing behind a gun designed for anti-aircraft work, firing at panzers at close range. His citation for the Distinguished Service Cross says he destroyed 1 tank and accounted for 2 others with well-directed hand grenade fire. That is a polite way of saying Darby was close enough to throw grenades at tanks. The Hermann Göring Division withdrew. 17 destroyed German tanks lay scattered in and around Gela. The Rangers had stopped a panzer division with rifles, grenades, naval support, and a colonel who refused to let his beach be taken. 2 months later, September 1943, the Rangers landed at Salerno and seized Chionzi Pass, the critical terrain controlling the roads inland from the beachhead. For 13 days, Rangers held that pass against continuous German assaults, artillery barrages, night-probing attacks, infantry assaults with mortar support. The Germans threw everything they had at the Rangers. Not 1 meter of ground was surrendered. German reports from Salerno noted that Rangers at Chionzi Pass fought with tenacity that exceeded normal infantry standards. Wounded Rangers continued fighting. Counterattacks were launched from defensive positions. Aggression unexpected from defending forces. By the end of the Salerno campaign, Darby was effectively commanding a force of 8,500 men, including attached units. But the corps that held the critical ground, the Rangers, numbered fewer than 2,000, and they had done what entire divisions sometimes could not. But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. The very reputation that made Rangers so effective was about to be used against them. Because the Rangers were elite, because they always delivered, commanders began using them for missions they were never designed for: conventional infantry operations, static defensive lines, winter mountain fighting near San Pietro and Cassino. Rangers were bleeding in the kind of grinding, attritional warfare that destroyed their greatest asset, the experienced, irreplaceable men who had trained at Aknakari and been blooded at Arzew. And then came Cisterna. I told you about Cisterna in the opening. Now you understand the context. Now you understand what was at stake. Let me take you back to that drainage ditch. January 30th, 1944, the Anzio beachhead. Allied forces had landed behind German lines, but the Allied commander, Major General John Lucas, hesitated instead of pushing inland immediately. German forces responded with terrifying speed. Within days, 8 German divisions surrounded the beachhead. The Hermann Göring Panzer Division, the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, the 71st Infantry Division, the 4th Parachute Division. Kesselring intended to push the Allies back into the sea. Lucas needed a breakthrough. The objective was Cisterna, a small town controlling road junctions essential to any advance. The mission went to the Rangers. The plan called for the 1st and 3rd Battalions to infiltrate 5 miles behind enemy lines, along drainage ditches, seize Cisterna in a surprise dawn assault, and hold it until the 3rd Infantry Division linked up. The 4th Battalion would attack along the road to clear the main approach. Intelligence said the path was clear. Remember that phrase from the opening? Intelligence was dead wrong. At 0130 hours, 767 Rangers from the 1st and 3rd Battalions stepped off into darkness. Single file, complete tactical silence. They passed within meters of German positions without being detected. For the first 3 miles, the infiltration was perfect. Then, at 0600, as the first grey light of dawn appeared, the drainage ditch ended. 800 meters of flat, open ground lay between the Rangers and Cisterna. No cover, no concealment, and daylight was coming. They crossed the open ground. German sentries spotted them immediately. Alarm whistles, machine guns opening up, and the Rangers discovered the terrible truth. They had infiltrated directly into the largest German force concentration in the entire Anzio sector. What followed was 8 hours of hell. Rangers fought from ditches, farmhouses, shell craters, anywhere that offered a shred of cover. German tanks maneuvered to cut off escape routes. Infantry closed in from 3 sides. Artillery fire walked through Ranger positions. The 4th Battalion tried to fight through to rescue them, but was stopped cold by minefields, tanks, and machine gun positions. By afternoon, ammunition was exhausted. Every round fired, bazookas empty, grenades gone, rifles down to last magazines. Major Alva Miller, commanding the 3rd Battalion, was killed leading a counterattack. Major Jack Dobson, commanding the 1st Battalion, was severely wounded. The survivors began disassembling their weapons, burying or scattering key parts so the Germans could not use them. And then Sergeant Major Eholt made that final radio call. "So long, Colonel. Maybe when it's all over, I'll see you again." Of 767 Rangers, 6 returned. By various accounts, the dead numbered in the dozens, the wounded in scores, and over 700 were marched into German captivity. The 4th Battalion lost 30 killed and 58 wounded trying to break through. Derby's Ranger force was effectively destroyed. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th Ranger battalions were disbanded. About 150 surviving veterans were sent home. Others were absorbed into the 1st Special Service Force. The unit that Derby had built from nothing at Ashnacarry, the unit that had stormed Arzu, terrorized the Italians at Sened Station, cracked Jebel El Ankh for Patton, held Gala against panzers, and defended Chionzi Pass for 13 days, was gone. Derby wept. Officers who had served with him for 2 years, who had never seen him show anything but iron composure, watched the man who turned down a general star to stay with his Rangers break down. But German after-action reports from Cisterna contained something that cuts through the tragedy. Even when surrounded, outnumbered, out of ammunition, and facing tanks at close range, Rangers continued fighting. Individual Rangers fought to the death rather than surrender positions. Small groups counterattacked against impossible odds. Even after officers were killed and units were broken into isolated pockets, Rangers kept fighting. German intelligence assessed that American Rangers displayed combat motivation, approaching Waffen-SS levels of determination. Coming from the Wehrmacht, which measured combat effectiveness the way accountants measure profit margins, that was the highest compliment an enemy could receive. Cisterna destroyed 3 Ranger battalions, but it did not destroy the idea of Rangers, because in England another commander was already preparing his men for a mission that would make Pointe du Hoc the most famous cliff in military history. And the same man who would lead that assault would face an even more brutal test 6 months later, in a frozen German forest that swallowed divisions whole. His name was James Earl Rudder, and he was about to ask 225 men to do something impossible. Part 4. The Cliff and the Guns. While Derby's Rangers were fighting and dying in Italy, a separate Ranger force had been taking shape on the other side of the Atlantic. The 2nd Ranger Battalion was activated on April 1st, 1943, at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The 5th Ranger Battalion followed shortly after. Both were built from scratch with American volunteers, then sent to England and put through the same brutal commando course at Achnacarry that had forged Derby's original battalion. The man chosen to command the 2nd Rangers was Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, 33 years old, born in Eden, Texas, a football coach before the war, first at Brady High School, then at Tarleton Agricultural College. Like Derby, Rudder had no special operations background. Like Derby, he had something more valuable than experience. When Rudder spoke, men believed him. When he said they could do something impossible, they believed that too. For 3 months in early 1944, the 2nd and 5th Rangers trained on cliffs along the English coast. They tested every climbing technique known to military science: rope ladders, rocket-fired grappling hooks, extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. They practiced until they could scale a 100-foot cliff face in under 5 minutes. Why? Because Allied planners had identified the single most dangerous position on the entire Normandy coast, Pointe du Hoc, a promontory jutting out between Utah and Omaha beaches, 100 feet of sheer cliff face rising straight from the sea. At the top, according to intelligence, 6 French-made 155mm guns sat in reinforced concrete casemates. Those guns had a range of 25 kilometers. They could fire on both invasion beaches simultaneously. They could destroy landing craft, kill troops in the water, and disrupt the entire invasion before it began. Every Allied planning document identified those guns as the gravest threat to the Normandy landings. The guns had to be destroyed, and the only way to reach them was to climb the cliff under fire. Think about what that means. Not climbing a cliff in training, not scaling a rock face on a pleasant afternoon, climbing a 100-foot cliff in combat gear, soaking wet from the channel, with German defenders on top throwing grenades down, machine guns firing from flanking positions, and mortar rounds exploding around you, in daylight, with no cover. If your rope is cut, you fall 100 feet onto rocks. If you make it to the top, you are immediately in close combat with an entrenched enemy who has been watching you climb for the last 3 minutes. You would not do that. I would not do that. No reasonable person would do that. 225 Rangers from Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Battalion volunteered to do exactly that. Among them was 1st Sergeant Leonard Bud Lomel, 24 years old, born in Brooklyn, New York, adopted as an infant by a Scandinavian immigrant family. He had attended Tennessee Wesleyan College on a football scholarship, lettered in football, and was an exceptional boxer. After graduating in 1941, he went back to New Jersey and worked as a brakeman on a freight train. While working there, he met a nurse named Charlotte Ewart, who would become his wife. Remember Lomel. You are going to hear his name twice more before this story is over, and by the end, historian Stephen Ambrose would call him the single individual, other than Eisenhower himself, most responsible for the success of D-Day, June 6, 1944, 0445 hours. The 225 Rangers loaded into British landing craft and headed for Pointe du Hoc. Naval bombardment from the battleship USS Texas and destroyers had been pounding the cliff top for over an hour. Hundreds of shells, but German defenses held. The approach was chaos. Rough seas, strong currents pushed the landing craft east of the target. The flotilla had to turn and fight its way back against the tide, burning precious minutes. German machine guns swept the small boats as they closed on the narrow beach at the base of the cliff. Mortar rounds exploded in the water. At 07:10, the landing craft grounded. Rangers jumped into waist-deep water and sprinted for the cliff. As the ramp dropped on Lomel's craft, a machine gun bullet slammed into his right side. He kept moving, reached the cliff face, fired a rocket grapnel. The rope shot upward, caught the cliff edge. Lomel began climbing, hand over hand, 100 feet, full combat gear, with a bullet wound in his side. Some ropes caught, others fell back. Germans cut ropes as fast as they were fired. Men fell, others kept climbing. German grenades tumbled down the cliff face. Rangers could not take cover. They climbed faster. Some reached the top in under 3 minutes. The first Rangers over the edge opened fire with automatic rifles, driving German defenders back. More Rangers crested the cliff. Within 30 minutes, 90 men had made it to the top and were engaging German positions on the plateau. But when they reached the gun emplacements, they found them empty. Massive concrete casemates, reinforced positions, but inside, only telephone poles painted to look like gun barrels. The guns had been moved. This is where most Hollywood versions of the story end. The longest day cuts to black, with a Ranger asking, "Sarge, you mean we came all this way for nothing?" But the real story was just beginning. Lomel, bleeding from his side wound, immediately led a patrol inland. His orders were to secure a coastal road between the two invasion beaches, about 250 yards from the highway, moving along a hedgerow with Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn. Lomel spotted heavy tire tracks in the dirt. He followed them. In a sunken orchard, camouflaged with netting, sat 5 of the 6 155mm guns, positioned, ready to fire. German ammunition stacked beside them. The gun crews had apparently moved to a nearby position, possibly for cover during the naval bombardment. The guns were unguarded. Lomel did not wait. He pulled 2 thermite grenades, climbed onto the nearest gun, and dropped them into the traversing mechanisms. Metal melted. Gears fused. He moved to the next gun and did the same. When his thermite grenades ran out, he smashed the sights and elevation mechanisms with his rifle butt. Kuhn kept watch while Lomel worked. Between them, they disabled all 5 guns. A separate patrol from Company E located the 6th gun and destroyed it as well, along with the ammunition cache. Before 0900 on June 6, 1944, every gun that threatened both invasion beaches had been neutralized. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had accomplished its D-Day mission before 9 in the morning. It was the first American unit to complete its objective that day. But now the Rangers on Pointe du Hoc were surrounded, cut off. German forces counterattacked from 3 directions. Artillery pounded Ranger positions. Infantry probed the perimeter. Communications equipment had been destroyed in the landing. No one at headquarters knew if the Rangers were alive or dead. For 2 days, they held, fighting from shell craters and shattered bunkers. Wounded men stayed on the firing line. Ammunition ran low, then ran out, then was scavenged from the dead. The perimeter shrank with every German probe. When relief forces finally reached Pointe du Hoc on the morning of June 8th, 90 Rangers were still fighting. Of the 225 who had climbed the cliff, approximately 135 had been killed, wounded, or were missing. But the position was held. That same morning on Omaha Beach, where the 29th Infantry Division had been pinned down by murderous German fire and could not advance, Brigadier General Norman Cotter found Ranger companies mixed in with the stalled troops. He asked what unit they were. 5th Rangers, they replied. Cotter looked at them and said 5 words that became the Ranger motto. Rangers, lead the way. And they did. Rangers moved off the beach, cleared German positions, and opened paths for the 29th Division to advance. At the moment when the entire Omaha landing hung in the balance, it was Rangers who broke the deadlock. D-Day made Rangers famous, but it did not make them finished, because 6 months later, the same men who climbed Pointe du Hoc and broke through on Omaha Beach would face a battle that made Normandy look almost merciful by comparison. A frozen hill in a forest that American generals should never have entered, where 4 divisions had already failed, where trees exploded into wooden shrapnel that killed men in their foxholes, where the Rangers would fight the most vicious close combat of the entire European war, and where Leonard Lomel, the man who saved D-Day, would become the last officer left standing. Part 5. The Last Hill and the Verdict. December 1944. The Hurtgen Forest, Germany. If you want to understand hell on Earth, this is where you look. A 140 square kilometer expanse of dense, dark forest east of the Belgian-German border. The trees were so thick that artillery shells exploded in the canopy, showering the men below with wooden splinters that killed as effectively as shrapnel. The forest floor was tangled with undergrowth and debris. Rain was constant. Temperature hovered near freezing. Mud was ankle-deep, and Germans were dug into every ridge, every ravine, every tree line with interlocking fields of fire, minefields, and pre-registered artillery. War correspondent Ernest Hemingway visited the Hurtgen and described it in 2 words: Passchendaele with tree bursts. The U.S. 9th Infantry Division entered the forest in September, gained 3 kilometers, lost 4,500 men. The 28th Division attacked next. No ground gain, 6,184 casualties. The 4th Division was committed, 6,053 casualties. Division after division fed into the meat grinder. By early December, American losses exceeded 33,000, and one objective still stood: Hill 400. The Germans called it Castle Hill, 400 meters high, the dominant terrain feature in the sector. Whoever held Hill 400 controlled observation of the Roer River Valley to the east and the approaches to Schmidt to the southwest. Every division that entered the Hurtgen had been ordered to take it. Everyone had failed. German defenders from the 272nd Volksgrenadier Division were dug into pillboxes and fighting positions across the steep, tree-covered slopes. A German general reportedly offered special awards to any unit that could hold the hill. General Walter Weaver, commanding the 8th Division, went to V Corps Commander General Leonard Gero and asked for Rangers. Gero approved. The 2nd Ranger Battalion, veterans of Point du Hoc and Omaha Beach, was pulled from the line and trucked to the village of Bergstein at the base of Hill 400. Lieutenant Bob Edlin of Company A led his platoon through snow, and A led his platoon through snow and ankle-deep mud to relieve elements of the 112th Infantry Regiment. There, the Rangers met the infantry they were replacing. Edlin recalled meeting a friend, Captain Preston Jackson, who told him, "Bob, this is the meanest son of a bitch you've ever seen in your life up there. I wish you wouldn't go." The Rangers went. December 7th, 1944. 3 years to the day since Pearl Harbor. Companies D and F, the assault force, gathered in a sunken road near a Catholic cemetery at the base of Hill 400. It was bitter cold. The men could see the hill looming above them. Open, snow-covered fields lay between them and the steep, wooded slopes. No cover for the approach. Several units had already been slaughtered trying to cross that ground. At 07:30, with no artillery preparation to preserve surprise, the Rangers attacked. They sprinted across the open field. German defenders opened fire from the hilltop. Machine guns, mortars. The Rangers ran faster. They hit the slopes and began climbing. The Germans above them started pulling back, then fired a red flare. Immediately, artillery and mortar fire from across the river, from the north, from Schmidt, began hammering the hill. The Germans had the position zeroed from every direction. The Rangers took the summit by sheer speed and fury. Historian Charles MacDonald wrote that the Rangers moved so swiftly that the Germans were thoroughly cowed. By 08:35, 2 companies had taken 28 prisoners and held the crest. Then the counterattacks began. At 09:30, German artillery shattered the silence. Then 100 German infantry came up the southeast slope. Then another wave from the south. Then another. 5 counterattacks over 2 days, each preceded by artillery so intense it collapsed bunkers and stripped the trees bare. Captain Walter Bloch, the battalion surgeon, a pediatrician in civilian life who had volunteered for the Rangers at Fort Dix, after his wife begged him not to join the paratroopers because it was too dangerous, was killed when the battalion aid station took a direct artillery hit on December 8th. A doctor who volunteered for Rangers because his wife thought paratroopers were too dangerous. Let that sink in. By noon of the first day, companies D and F had only 32 men between them. The commanding officer of D Company had been captured. Lieutenant Tom Rowland had been shot dead repulsing a flanking attack. Lieutenant Ken McClure was down with a shattered leg. Lieutenant George Kirschner was nursing a shoulder wound. One officer was still standing on top of Hill 400, Leonard Lomel, the same man who had climbed Point du Hoc with a bullet in his side, the same man who destroyed the guns that saved D-Day, now a second lieutenant after a battlefield commission, wounded again, a concussion and shrapnel in his left arm that rendered it useless, and he was the entire command structure on that hilltop. Lomel gathered the surviving sergeants, Ed Seeker, Mike Sharik, Elrod Petty, Herm Stein. Their uniforms were splotched with drying blood. He positioned his 91 remaining Rangers in a line across the hilltop and prepared for the next wave. When 150 German Fallschirmjäger, elite Luftwaffe paratroopers, came swarming up the southeast slope, bayonets fixed, outnumbering the defenders 10-1, Sergeant Ed Seco did something that defies rational explanation. He grabbed 2 machine pistols from wounded German soldiers, charged directly into the oncoming attack, and fired both weapons simultaneously. His remaining men followed. They drove the paratroopers back down the slope. Lieutenant Howard Kettlehut, a forward observer from the 56th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, called in fire from every artillery piece available in the entire corps. 18 battalions in all, 155 mm howitzers, 8-inch guns, even 240 mm heavies. The German attackers walked into a wall of steel. Late on December 8th, an infantry regiment relieved the surviving Rangers. Of the roughly 470 Rangers who went into the Hill 400 and Bergstein fight, approximately 225 were casualties. On the hilltop alone, 23 killed, 86 wounded, 4 missing. The Rangers had suffered 90% casualties in the assault companies. Again, a week later, the infantry regiment that replaced them lost the hill to a German counterattack. The Americans did not retake it until February 1945. What the Rangers held with blood and willpower, fresh troops could not. So, why did German troops fear the United States Army Rangers more than any other Allied unit? Let me give you the forensic verdict. It was not because Rangers had better weapons. They did not. They carried the same M1 Garands, the same BARs, the same bazookas as every other American unit. They had less artillery support than line divisions, less armor, less of everything that conventional military doctrine says you need to win. It was not because Rangers were superhuman. They bled. They died. They suffered catastrophic losses at Cisterna, at Pointe du Hoc, at Hill 400. 3 times in the war, Ranger battalions were effectively destroyed. Here is what made them different. Here is what German prisoner interrogations consistently revealed. Here is why a single Ranger battalion required the same defensive preparations that the Wehrmacht normally reserved for an entire American division. Rangers were unpredictable. They did not attack the way normal infantry attacked. They went around defenses. They infiltrated through gaps. They appeared from directions the enemy never expected. At El Ghata, they marched 12 miles through mountains at night to attack from the rear. At Pointe du Hoc, they climbed a cliff that no sane military planner would consider an avenue of approach. At Hill 400, they sprinted across open ground with no artillery preparation because speed and surprise were worth more than firepower. Rangers were relentless. Once committed, they did not stop. They did not retreat. They did not pull back to regroup and try again tomorrow. They fought until the objective was taken, or until every Ranger was dead or wounded. At Cisterna, they fought for 8 hours with no ammunition. At Pointe du Hoc, they held for 2 days with 90 men against continuous counterattacks. At Hill 400, they held with 32 men against 150 Fallschirmjäger. German units learned that you could not bluff Rangers into withdrawing. You could not suppress them with artillery and expect them to fall back. You had to kill them, every single one. Rangers closed the distance. German tactical doctrine relied on defensive firepower, machine guns, artillery, minefields, obstacles, all designed to keep attackers at range. Rangers negated that advantage by closing to hand-to-hand range as fast as physically possible. Grenades, bayonets, rifle butts. By the time defensive fires were organized, Rangers were already inside the position. That combination, unpredictability, relentlessness, and extreme close-range aggression, created psychological pressure no other Allied unit matched. German forces facing Rangers maintained higher alert levels, defended in all directions, could not assume night meant rest or difficult terrain meant security. The mental cost was exhaustion and reduced effectiveness across an entire sector. 1 Ranger battalion, 500 men, creating the same defensive burden as 10,000. That was the Ranger force multiplier. Not firepower, not technology, Men, training, leadership, and a willingness to pay any price. William Darby did not survive to see the end. On April 30th, 1945, serving as assistant division commander of the 10th Mountain Division in northern Italy, Darby was standing outside a command post near the town of Torboli when a German 88mm shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel killed him almost instantly. He was 34 years old. 2 days later, German forces in Italy surrendered. The man who turned down a general's star to stay with his Rangers. The man who climbed every cliff first, waded every stream first, led every assault from the front. The man who wept when Cisterna fell. He died 2 days before the war ended in his theatre. He received his general's star posthumously. It was, in a way, the cruelest irony of the entire story. Darby refused the star when it would have saved his life by pulling him from combat. He received it only after death. James Earl Rudder survived. He stayed in the Army Reserve after the war, became president of Texas A&M University in 1959, and served until his death in 1970. Every year he returned to Pointe du Hoc with whatever Rangers could make the trip, fewer each year. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan visited Pointe du Hoc for the 40th anniversary of D-Day. 62 Rangers who had climbed the cliff were there, old men now, standing on the ground where they had been young and terrified and brave. Reagan called them the boys of Pointe du Hoc, the men who took the cliffs, the champions who helped free a continent. Leonard Lomel, the adopted kid from Brooklyn who worked as a freight train brakeman, who climbed Pointe du Hoc with a bullet in his side and destroyed the guns that threatened D-Day, who held Hill 400 as the last officer standing with a useless arm and a concussion, went to law school on the GI Bill. He founded his own law firm. He played Santa Claus at Ranger reunions. He wrote a 186-page letter to his grandchildren on his 80th birthday. He took his family back to Normandy in 1999 and told his grandchildren the story of what happened on those cliffs. He died in 2011, at 91 years old, after more than 200 days of combat, 3 wounds, and a lifetime of service that began when a kid from Brooklyn decided to volunteer for hazardous duty. And Sergeant Major Robert E. Holt, the man who made the last radio call from Cisterna, he survived German captivity. At O-Flag 64 prison camp, on the 4th of July, the prisoners somehow produced an American flag. The camp orchestra played the Star-Spangled Banner, and E. Holt, the man who had told Darby, "So long, Colonel," stood in formation and cried. It was only the second time he cried in 15 months as a prisoner. The Rangers of World War II were disbanded after the war, but when Korea came, they were needed again. Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan. The 75th Ranger Regiment carries the lineage of those World War II battalions. The scroll comes from Darby's Rangers. The standard remains, Rangers lead the way, and the reason the Germans feared them has not changed in 80 years. It is not about weapons. It is not about technology. It is about men who volunteer for the hardest missions, accept the highest risk, and refuse to quit until the job is done, or they cannot physically continue. You do not need 2 divisions to stop 800 men, unless those 800 men are Rangers. If you found this deep dive valuable, hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm this kind of military history matters. Leave a comment and tell us if you have a connection to Ranger history. And remember, every name in this story was a real person. Every battle was real blood. These stories deserve to be remembered. I will see you in the next one.